Hello, good evening. I'm Roxana Markoch, curator in the Department of Photography. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all together with my colleagues and co-organizers, Sara Meister and Eva Respini, to tonight's forum. This is our second year and fifth session of the Contemporary Photography Forums. And as you can see, we are a full room, and I want to thank you for that, for your participation. I think it's super important that we keep this platform, that we come together as an artistic and intellectual community together, and we keep the debate up. So we have invited for this particular session four artists, Walid Beshti, Collier Shore, James Welling and Hank Willis Thomas to basically lead the discussion about the meaning, the scope, the perspectives of photography in the 21st century. And since this is an extremely broad topic, we have asked each one of them to advance three questions that we have emailed to you, and they are also printed out on the papers on your seats. And so they will be leading the discussion, and without real further ado, I would like to give the word to whoever of you would like to start. There are mics all around the room, so we want you all to be engaged in the discussion. And I believe, James, are you going to start?
Am I on? Okay. Well, we met outside in the ante-room talking about how we were going to handle it. And I forget whose idea it was that I would start first, but we very quickly sort of reviewed each other's questions, and they kind of congeal into a couple of basic questions. And I'm sure we'll get to the sort of core of those questions. But I think one of the things that would be interesting is if, well, my impression of this event was we would be asking questions of the panel of 6 experts up on stage, the way it was a year ago. So I was not prepared to be sitting here asking questions and also answering questions, just asking. Anyway, I had, of my 3 questions, 2 involve kind of issues around digital technology. So I wanted to first ask, or rephrase my initial question about the legacy of the pictures generation, or the residue of the pictures generation. Because I remember I was at an event, a conference that was held at the Hammer Museum, and actually Joel was there, and Uta Barth wondered why everyone was referencing Robert Frank and Walker Evans as the kind of photographers that were the kind of figures that people were following after. And Uta said that she didn't really think much about Robert Frank's work in relation to her work. And so I started thinking about the whole question of influence and the photographers or the artists who influenced the pictures generation. And by that I mean not only the artists who were in Doug Eklund's show, but the artists who came of age in the 70s working with photography, for whom people like Warhol and Rauschenberg were extremely important, and less important were the street photographers from the 50s and 60s. So my question was, what is the legacy of artists who looked to Baldessari or Douglas Hubler today for another generation? And is it possible that there's an alternative kind of history in photography that doesn't necessarily go through Frank or Evans?
I think also, just to add, one of the things that we were talking about, because when we initially posed the questions, maybe it was due to the fact that we were requested to ask questions through the museum, we felt like we were posing them to the institution. And And so now we find ourselves in this room, and the idea that we're not necessarily posing them to the institution, but the institution is allowing us to ask them. So I think then we're a large room full of people. So I guess just to sort of, to put again just a little bit of pressure on the curators at MoMA to feel free to participate in answering the questions, because we did sort of form them thinking about you all.
Well, and also, I should say there's many institutions present in this room. It happens to be hosted by MoMA, but there are representatives here from many of our colleagues in New York and elsewhere. So hopefully it won't just be a MoMA-centric conversation. That's the sort of point of these forums.
And I would open up one of my questions to any of the other institutions in the room.
Which question?
That other question.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there was something so absolutely perverse about your question that I loved, because it seemed like all of the questions that were being posed, I mean, as has been said, were posed to the institution, and they all seem to speak to questions of like, how is history maintained? What will a collection look like in the future? But yours in particular points at this kind of this distance, right? That's supposed to be in place when one is talking about an institutional framework, that it's meant to be objective, neutral territory, absolute, and a kind of a criteria of judgment, or a stable entity that's not governed by individual personalities, particular directions overtly, and everyone knows that kind of neutrality never really exists in an institutional frame, and that's actually what makes them so interesting, is not the mandate toward that open field. So in a funny way, your question, in the way that it has an impoliticness to it, or kind of it's something that one is never meant to ask in public, and that's what's sort of amazing about it, because it pokes at that it's a bunch of individuals who actually do construct a notion of what the discipline is and how it's formulated and how it exists in a public field, and what is the role of an artist in relationship to that, when it is all these kinds of minute negotiations and things. So in a funny way, it opened up for me the territory that everyone else was sort of poking at, but not confronting that symptom, that actual defined rupture, that break between an artist and their role within a museum.
Well, I think I can actually figure out a way to bring it back to James's question. By saying, and I would love to, I could talk all night about my question, because I asked it in a kind of precocious mood, and I actually have maintained that mood ever since. And I think you're right. I think but what happens is the older you get, and I'm sure the really old ones in this room will know what I'm talking about, the older you get, the less intimidated you are by the idea that there's an institution and it has this power to kind of make your dreams come true. And the first thing you know is because other people have had the show and their dreams didn't come true. And you also know that everyone can't have the show. And so, you may or you may not. But I think I guess I was thinking about lineage and who I assume will have a show, who I've seen have a show, and why they've had a show. And so maybe as a way of going back to James, because I really did want him to go first, I would ask, are our influences a way of predicting our acceptance in the institutions? And the institutions look at what you're referencing or where you come from in a way of trying to understand what you do and how to position you. And so how important is it to come from a place to be recognizably connected to a certain trend in art or photography?
In relationship to your question is just still, but it's my relationship to Jim's question. I kind of feel like, in a sense, the pictures generation and the near predecessors kind of actually maybe killed photography as we know it in a sense, like it was the beginning of the end of the joy of picture making, for the sake of picture making, which I think people who were more in the lineage of Robert Frank were still kind of really attached to the emotional way of documenting life and the kind of visual experience. Whereas my interpretation, one of my professors was Larry Sultan, who I think is very much in that tradition of the picture generation. And I think my heart was broken the moment that he was like, why don't you, where I took a photograph that I really loved of my mother, and he was just like, that thing's in behind her head, why don't you just go back and retake it? And I was just like, but that ruins the moment. And he's like, but who cares? And I feel like, although I later came to agree with him, I think that also kind of spoiled the innocence for me in the chance that came with like taking the perfect picture, the magic moment, the decisive moment. And, I blame you guys for that.
Let me think about that. I think it's absolutely an accurate kind of description of a kind of somewhat of a deflation, joylessness. But I think there's other side to it, which comes from knowing or being aware. What Collier was describing, the kind of lost illusions angle of aging. So there's there was a premature aging in the pictures generation you're describing, of seeing that a certain kind of innocence in art it can't be carried on. But I think you're right to point that out. I've actually never thought of that way.
I've been thinking about it a lot.
I remember when I took just one photography class at SVA, and Laurie Simmons was the teacher, and we had to make a self-portrait. And I brought in a tear sheet of Brooke Shields because in my other class with Carol Squires, I felt like we were kind of being told not to photograph women, or we were looking at photography in such a critical way, and we were looking at newsprint and tear sheets, and that it was an effective message to say, I don't want to take my own picture, and this is what I've chosen to submit instead. And for me, the pictures generation was, there's also like a lot of different people with a lot of different agendas spinning off of that. So I think that you later find out that, there had to have been a ton of pleasure in Sherry Levine's practice when, she started painting things, because I think that, that was part of the work. And so I think the pleasure just got relocated in different kind of, in finding different kind of satisfaction, maybe.
Whose pleasure are we talking about? Are we talking about a public, an audience, someone confronting a plastic object? Or are we talking about the pleasure in making stuff?
I think it's a pleasure in making stuff, because I think an audience accepts almost everything you put in front of it, and they find a way to commodify it, objectify it.
I wish we could all be that lucky.
No?
I think of the moment when, I had, like, in school, where I got really sick of art and art school, where it was all people talking about how they felt about stuff and talking about their feelings about things. And that was sort of the legitimization of making things. And really, when I started thinking about that larger social frame, that felt like the revelation, or the possibility that was opened up was for the larger social life associated with objects. So, I think you can still have pleasure making stuff. Anybody is allowed. There's a democratic possibility in making things. But I always worry about this confusion of a pleasure of a maker being assumed to be the pleasure of the receiver. And it's always the receiver that's left in this ambiguous, amorphous zone of, well, they just do this one thing, or the public is one thing, or is some unaccountable kind of thing. And so, I don't know. So I had the exact opposite sensation, that I felt like the real revelation for me was when I realized there was a larger world that these things performed within. and where I stopped needing or stopped getting into conversations about how much fun you were having while you were making it, because I think people have fun all the time. You know what I mean? It's not.
I rarely have fun when I'm making it, but
And I
have
hate seeing
pleasure.
pictures of people having fun. I mean, who wants to look at other people's vacations? That's not fun. I mean, you know, if you had fun doing this thing, why does that legitimate a public address? And I feel like public address has stakes. You know?
But I just think going to what Hank said for a second, that there was a moment, I think, that the legacy was like this stalled car where there were so many things that you couldn't do or things that you seemed like you weren't supposed to do. And then I think, I think things progressed, and I think people found a way to make things after appropriation.
Collier, I just think it's so interesting that you use the words Sherry Levine and pleasure in the same sentence. I just don't know if Sherry's motivations for making work, have to do with pleasure. And I don't know how many artists would say, I make this thing because there is a pleasure in it.
Really? So you can look at those shiny things, and you can look at a sort of kind of Kaysen painting and not think that there was. I don't think her agenda was pleasure, like having pleasure, but I just think that there's. When I looked at those paintings, as opposed to the Walker Evans rephotographs, I thought there's some subtle engagement that she's having that is giving, and that's my imagination, maybe it's not the case. But I think we're talking about pleasure maybe in a couple of different ways. I think there's a certain innate stimulation to getting to kind of make something a little bit. And for any photographer that sort of has, printed black and white as opposed to color, you have that sensation of making something. But maybe I'm being romantic.
Well, then what would you imagine Sherry felt when she was appropriating the Walker Evans?
Well, that I think she probably just was making a crappy, RC print. And I think the pleasure was, I don't know.
Getting away with stealing.
Taking the picture, the pleasure was.
See, how do we get from A to B there?
But the painting was
painting
different.
is pleasure, and appropriating a photograph is just
It's a different kind of pleasure.
doing a crappy.
But I
whatever.
think the whole pleasure, is removing it from the main reason for making something. I mean, that's what your revelation was, that, or when you were talking about, you realized that you didn't need to be making something pleasurable, having a pleasurable experience, or listening to people talk about the pleasure of making, but to have a larger, what do you call it, pleasure of understanding the world. But there is a kind of satisfaction. It sounds like you're describing.
Yeah, and I think, maybe the pleasure of that body of work for Sherry Levine was the provocation. There's lots of dimensions to, there's lots of dimensions which could satisfy why you keep doing something. But I feel like it's so unknowable in the sense of, it seems so, I don't totally understand what's at stake in bringing up a conversation about what an artist feels like when they're making stuff. There's something fundamentally that I just absolutely don't understand about that question. And I don't know that you can actually access that by looking at a thing. Right? I don't know. Maybe I don't understand.
I think that goes back to what we were discussing in the beginning, because I think also for Sherry at that moment, whether it was a photograph or whether it was a painting, it was really the same act. And it was sort of getting back, reappropriating a tradition. And that goes back to both of your queries in the beginning,
Is there such thing as intellectual pleasure too in this context? You're talking about relocation of pleasure on a certain level. Why not then consider pleasure to be also intellectual?
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what I was thinking. I think it matters to me I envy artists who I think enjoy their work, or who have the time to do stuff that I would never ever do. like when I see stuff that's really labor intensive, that part of the joy of the work is the pain that I know they went through. And, you know, and then there's other times I know when I'm talking to some of my peers and they're like, what did you do today? You know, man, I was just in the studio just figuring stuff out. And it was like, you know, I had this real revelation and it was cool. And I'm like, what did you do? I was like, I did email, you know, and I'm like, there is this thing of like, and I feel like that when you can see artists either with their camera or other materials experimenting, like I really read that often into the work. And
But do you like email?
I hate email.
Then don't do it.
Maybe we should actually take this opportunity to ask another question, because I feel like we've got stalled on.
Okay,
something.
when do you,
One more.
Yeah, I agree that any discussion about what an artist feels at the moment they're making their work is useless, but and would be very boring. But I believe that all artists have great pleasure in the process of making their art and are concerned with the making rather than with things made.
that was Michael A. Smith.
I just have to give a little postscript to the Sherry thing.
I have one more
because
thing I have to say.
Then my question is why? Because when I was very young, I did that show at Lake Gallery, and I had as the front piece a real Walker Evans and the Sherry Levine RC print. So then my question is when Sherry, and this is a ridiculous question, but let's just say that Sherry Levine is somewhere in the building. It's curious to me now in thinking my reaction to the painting that Sherry made, because I remember it somehow weirdly being at 303 for a minute. My reaction to that painting was, wow, that's real. And my reaction to the Walker Evans was, wow, that's really fake. And that was a choice. It was a choice for her to choose to reproduce the photograph in its sort of cheapest, most facsimile, way, instead of making a copy and egg and making a black and white print that was a match to it. But when she made the painting really looked good, and it looked like a painting, and it looked like someone liked making it. And so I think that's why it sticks in my head, and I think about the pleasure in that moment, because for me that was a jump in saying that you could be involved in this intellectual pursuit and this provocation and this appropriation, and you could still handle something. And that made a huge impression.
I just want to respond a little bit to what Hank said, which is, you said that the pictures generation, you guys killed photography. I believe it was actually the catechism of criticism that what built up around the pictures generation that is what made photography an absolutely unacceptable medium to practice.
And also, I mean, I think now the funny thing, and I was thinking about what you just said, just sort of reinforced what I was thinking about when Jim was speaking too, was that it seems like now there's actually a separation between the critical armature that arose at the same time that's usually confused for the motivations behind that work. And now those two things feel like they're actually separated, where you can actually look at that work and not think of it as a end game foreclosure, melancholic kind of exercise on the evacuation of meaning, but there's, the same thing happens with like whatever's under the sort of umbrella term institutional critique in the same way. And I think of Michael Asher's work a lot is the inability to separate him from his most public critic. And in a funny way, there's so much humor and perversity and, really funny things going on in it that kind of get excised because of the strong identification, I think, and the strength that criticism had. I feel like at that point, I mean, I wasn't an adult then, and I didn't live through it, but the sense that I have is that criticism had such an urgency that oftentimes the critical armature got conflated with the work. And I think now those two things feel like they're actually pulling apart. They're actually separating in a way that you can find these things that you don't, that sense of, the end of fun, making things being fun or whatever. I just don't buy it now, and I think it's easy not to buy it now looking back. Can
I just jump in and comment on that? But I mean, that wouldn't be the first instance, right, where you could pose an opposition between a critic and an artist. I mean, quite famously and melodramatically, you have that with Greenberg and Pollock. It's just an obvious example. But also the salon critics of the 19th century and the artists that they're writing about. But what's more striking, I think you're quite right to point it out, and Jim should really speak to this, but was that the work invited that and seemed to come out of its own deeply felt critical thinking. Also, that wouldn't have been the first time where an artist took on the role of a critic, but in this case, it was really in the works. And so it made it fraught then to have other voices. It's as if, in a way, that the essays written around the work were actually works, right? I mean, that would be a mistake, but a mistake that would be easy to make. So, and that I think is quite germane to a larger discussion, which it seems to me this forum is hoping to address about the state of photography, I suppose. But that moment around 1980 seems to, raise those stakes for the first time. In other words, that there's a general discussion as to what is the difference between a photograph and a piece of critical writing.
I feel like this question kind of leads kind of interestingly into Collier's first question. Should I read it or? Okay. Sometimes I feel that curators are very reserved, like newscasters. We are never meant to know their true feelings. Are there works of art that make you feel vulnerable?
Roxana.
No, I was just thinking while reading it now, but I think that that artists are totally unreserved. They are like the weather. We always seem to find out what their true feelings are, and truly their works and themselves make us extremely vulnerable.
Can you give an example? Soon.
But I think it's an unfair question because I appreciate the fact that, a curator doesn't operate, for the most part, as this independent entity. I think I thought about it because I wondered how often curators feel like they're sort of out on a limb, or they're sort of, they're supporting something and they're really not sure, and they don't really have a sense of it being necessarily appreciated. And I was thinking actually about one of my favorite performers, Ariel Pink, who recently said in an interview, maybe a year ago, he said that he was, and I'm really poorly paraphrasing, but that he was disappointed to realize that he was not going to die unknown. That he was worried that he was appreciated in some sense, and that that he didn't maybe expect the kind of recognition, and having it was a bad sign to him. And so it made me think about how curators look at art and how quickly they can understand kind of things that are going on underneath it when there's age difference, culture difference, gender difference, all these things, and how long it takes, and therefore like how quickly one can risk something. Like how do you kind of work with something that you're not sure you can even mold?
I think to a certain extent, especially when you work at an institution like MoMA, there, people do feel as if we sort of hide behind the institution. But I think this institution and many others are made up of curators with individual passions. You can't work for 2 years on a show and not have a passion for that artist or the topic or the theme. And you can't do it day in and day out with a relatively modest salary, let's say, unless you really have a passion for it. And I truly believe that. Maybe it sounds cliche to say it. And we are a collecting institution, so we have a responsibility to a larger history and to represent that larger history. But within that, we have several curators in the department, and I think within that, we each are able to pursue our individual passions with a sense of responsibility to the institution.
But really understand, it wasn't for me a personal question. It was more of like, the difference between sort of watching someone on Fox News or watching someone on PBS and listening to them tell you about something and wondering how much of it is allowed to be personal.
So you prefer Fox?
But it's also about, it seems to be, that question too, it seems to be also about the legibility of those things, of an individual as a passion and a very particular perspective on something. And I think being in a room like this, most people are aware of who people are and what shows they've done, like both as artists and as curators, and what institutions they work for and what the sense of those institutions are. But I wonder about how that's articulated to a public. In other words, how far that, in terms of, and not being a curator, you know, I don't have, it's not a loaded question for me, but I mean, how much should that, you know, the idiosyncrasies or the particular types of engagements or interests be foregrounded? Because I think when, you know, you see like, you know, during Fleet Week or something, I don't think they're thinking about like, you know, they're just like, all of this stuff here is important art, right? And is that necessary to convey that these are very particular kinds of arguments about historical periods, about artists, about, you know, that curation actually does formulate in a very, it's not just, it might perform as newscasting when you're very distanced from it, but it actually really formulates what art history is and what the experience or understanding even what the photography is. I mean, that's the most public way that that gets established.
Yeah, I mean, I think as one of the curators who does more collection installations, so you put forward a history of photography, and you know, people come through like Fleet Week and every other day and they say, oh, this is the history of photography. But one of the reasons we change it as often as we do, and it's a lot of work every time we do, is because we don't believe that there, individually or collectively, that there's a history of photography. And so every time you do another one and you put forward something that's of particular interest to you, like I just put up this little pictures by Philip Elliott, and you know, what makes me feel vulnerable about it in particular as an object is that I don't understand it. Like I can't quite grasp it. But I put it next to a Rudy Burkhart picture that somehow makes it feel real to me. And I think for each of us, there's an aspect of, you know, when you may or you may not sense this on the walls, but there is an individual connection and a passion with these. And by changing it often enough, it allows a balance between what you think your institutional voice is and what your personal one is.
But I always wonder, I mean, why isn't the curator's name like on top of that show? Like that's what I'm always curious, oh, who did this? What else have they done? What are they proposing with this? You know, and you always have to like dig, and sometimes you can't find it on the website or anywhere. Like it's just unauthored.
I think that it has to do, and this came before in this forum, with something that is almost imperceptible to the outside, but it exists as a reality inside. And that is that the collection is presented as various histories, because it is constantly, it's not linear anymore, it's constantly changing. It's not for years, but rather for months on view, and then it's changed in a different version. So, which is called, a collection installation. And you're talking about an exhibition, which rightly so for someone from outside the institution. You come to the museum, and this is an exhibition. And I think that, in fact, we should change that. I think it's very important to have the name of the curator. If it's a collection installation or a temporary exhibition done from the collection, I think it's good because, indeed, there are very different voices. And I think too much in the past it has been perceived as a monolithic culture. And it would be good to change that in a certain way, to see the diversity that exists, because there is huge diversity in this institution, and we are seeking for even further diversity than you see right now.
James?
Okay. I think it's time for Waleed. Do you want to read it?
It was meant to be read, not read aloud.
I just should mention that some of the questions are very short and some succinct and some are longer, but when Waleed sent the questions, he apologized for being too short. So.
Jim?
Waleed.
I thought you were going to read it.
Waleed, which do you like better of your questions? Since they're so long, you only get one.
it's something that I'm just sort of curious about. I don't know how to.
I think
Yeah.
Hank said that our first question was the most important one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you want me to read? You got out of reading it. But I think that that's okay. What, if anything, is to be gained by approaching photography as a discrete medium?
Sarah Charlesworth?
Right. Does my mic work?
It does, Sarah Charlesworth.
I think at this point it's quite counterproductive to approach photography as a discrete medium. And I think a lot of the discussions get skewed by our using an old-fashioned terminology or categories that really aren't applicable to the way we as artists work today. I think to return to Jim's initial question about the pictures generation and Hank's discussing about how the work of the pictures generation made it so hard for you to engage in a practice in which you found a great deal of pleasure. I think if we look at the word photography, it doesn't in any way approach the breadth of the kinds of issues and concerns of just people even in this room. I had Doug Hubler as a teacher and Joseph Kasuth as a mentor. And as a young artist, I supported myself doing freelance photography, which had nothing to do with my work whatsoever. I just happened to be able to take pictures. And for me, having Doug and Joseph both as mentors, the challenge was to really try to understand the issues that art had to come to terms with, the issues of my generation and of my time. And when I first started doing work using newspapers that later became called appropriation and pictures generation and so on, it had nothing to do with being photography. It had much more to do with trying to understand the world in which I lived and what was a valid way to practice as an artist. And I think a lot of Jim also did paintings in his early work just as much as he did unusual types of photography. And I think a lot of those artists that were part of the pictures generation weren't trying to be photographers. On the contrary, we were just trying to understand the relationship that images had to our lives, and appropriation came more from trying to look at the world and the way images affected our experience. And I think when we keep returning to these categories like photography as though all these practices were part of the same lineage, it really, it diminishes all the different kinds of practices. I still think it's completely valid to go and see the world and observe it and reframe it through a camera. And I also think it's completely valid to rethink the way we think about ideas about art and about practice. And there's no reason why we have to situate ourselves within these old-fashioned words like painting and photography and curation. One of the more brilliant shows I've seen curated here at MoMA was that Vic Muniz show, where Vic's name was really large over the entry or the title of the show. I don't remember what the title was, but I remember that he curated it. And I think the very idea that artists are the only people who are performing creative acts that challenge the way we think about things is completely mistaken. And I think we need to let go of that as well. Curating and the way in which we situate ourselves within these institutions and languages all kind of needs to be re-examined and disrupted and released. I mean, I think that it's diminishing the way we think about these things.
I think part of the dilemma is that we're trying to compare photographic practice in its entirety to other media that we know, like painting or sculpture. And there's a definite tradition that people say, oh, look, there's a sculptural tradition, there's a spatial tradition, painting, so on. Now, photography, personally, I feel, occupies this really pivotal moment in the development of a medium of expression. It's the very first one that kind of splinters. I mean, now that we're firmly in the 21st century, we see lots of different media, all with digital forms, which do this naturally. But photography was the first one. And it first split with still and motion picture. And we try not to see them as being the same. But, you know, all of us know that we're influenced by motion picture makers and they're influenced by us. And so I'm thinking as you're saying this, okay, so we put the people who work this way in the photographic tradition over there in that ghetto. And we're going to let that be a tradition? I mean, that doesn't take us anywhere. But it's more complicated to put everyone in the same room, but I think it's more fun in the end.
One of the things that I think about when I hear that is the frustration sometimes I have in teaching photography, because every kind of photography is sort of valid. There's such a democracy right now in photography. The best thing is the worst thing. The best thing is that now people can actually take a picture or cannot take a picture. They can cut it up, they can draw it on a, iPad, and it all kind of exists within this umbrella of, for better or for worse, photography. The only difficult thing is that there's not a sense of rebellion because there's not a really particular status quo that students who are studying kind of want to escape. So when I was studying, there was the sense that you didn't really take a picture because street photographers, new color photographers was not something you wanted to follow. And you didn't necessarily feel that you could, at 18 in 1985, appropriate pictures and really kind of get away with it for that long. And so you kind of felt like you were bumping your head up against something, and you had to figure out some new way of doing it. And now I think students feel that they can kind of pick from any one of these categories, which is fantastic, except that, you do get a lot of young people making Joel's work and Stephen Shore's, and you say, but wait a second, why do you want to make those guys work? But, there are so many traditions that are tolerable in a way that I wonder in painting departments, if that's the case, if there's really so many different kinds of painting that would seem totally reasonable to make at this point.
I think Collier's point's an interesting one, and if you talk to a lot of students, I work with a lot of graduate students, and you just see that people are sensing what has been said, that this is a great transitional moment, and that the options are so wide open, and that the ways that we've looked at photography, and especially in institutions, tend to have frameworks around them and certain kind of distinctions about what we'll look at and what we won't look at. And this seems to be a time to stop doing that, right? So then the question is, how do departments of photography, and this is not just directed at MoMA, but how do departments of photography and museums operate as we go forward? How do you set up a situation to support this kind of investigation into the medium and its power and even its pleasure, whatever those pleasures are, whether they're, pleasure of making things or the pleasure of, perversely poking people about ideas or whatever. But how does that happen in photography departments now? And how do we, at this point, when the materiality of photography is in question and the intentionality and the distribution of photography is in question, how does a museum handle that? The design department in this museum handles design and whatever media things come at. Photography does it. So how can you do it? I mean, what are people and institutions thinking about that?
Well, I mean, it depends also. That would go back, I guess, to the various definitions of what photography is, right? Whether it is a material, right? Whether it deals with very specific physical properties, like photographic paper and camera and film, or whether it deals with processes of representation. Because that would go back to some questions that you had. What is a photograph? Is it something that is disseminated through publication? A billboard? Is the various type of images and the relationship of whether it is a photograph or a picture. And you can pick up the thread. But I think that where we are moving towards right now is a much more pan-institutional initiatives of looking across mediums at an artist's work. that's exactly where we are now. And this is new for us too in a certain way. So it's very exciting. It's very refreshing. And I think there is a lot of collaboration going on. But we are trying to understand the artist's work. And then we think more in terms of the medium, obviously within a historical tradition too, but also in terms of the conservation more than necessarily in ghettoizing it in the way that it has been discussed now.
I think, Marvin, I mean, all of the things you were describing are still photographic, and that's the interesting thing, that like the pie is getting bigger, and it's getting cut into, it's not being cut into more pieces, it's just expanding. So I guess, the question, could photography, I guess my question is photography the same as a picture? I mean, and Wally talks about this, and this was something that I remember someone had suggested at UCLA, that we just get rid of photography and we just have a pictures department and include, time-based and still. And I always thought that was a terrible idea, in spite of the fact that cinema has given a tremendous amount to still photography. The question of Waleed's question, I would disagree that we should get rid of the idea of the photograph. The photograph still seems extremely
but
flexible.
I know.
I don't know if you were talking about getting rid of it, but
just part of. Sorry, I cut you off, but my sense of it is not like what I could care less what the definition of photography is. It seems arbitrary, and if that arbitrary distinction to keep kind of like things discrete, departmental autonomy in a good place, differences of opinion, et cetera, that's great. And if there's a different arbitrary division that can be used, like you could just do, decades. Like we are the 60s and 70s department. And that way, like drawing wouldn't have to buy the Hubler and not the photo department. You know what I mean? Like these kinds of
what about just red?
Wouldn't be
like
necessary.
we deal with red.
Yeah, or where and when you get to these kinds of categorical delimiters, it's just like, well, how useful are they in this instance? And that's what I was sort of curious about. Is if in some level you can't, I would be hard pressed to really draw a hard boundary around painting or sculpture or photography. I don't think it's particularly useful. It seems, it's like mid 19th century kinds of medium-based distinctions that it's just bizarre to me somewhat. But at the same time, maybe they're good because they've been there for a while and the system has developed around it. And you have lots of arbitrary systems like
maybe photography is trans. Yeah.
There you go.
Sure. That's what, like, I'm sitting here, I'm just thinking it's just totally trans and you can't recognize it necessarily for what it is. And if there has to be a new pronoun for it.
But what I think is duplicitous and what's scary about the term to me is that people will use it as a mask to propose a very narrow definition and act as though it's ontological, it's the origin of the thing. And that's where I think it has a really negative public role, because if it's treated as though this is actually really discrete and these terms are hard-edged, and when you hear people like, in grad school, people were like, well, that's not really photography, and I went to a particularly conservative graduate program, but that there was this thing of, and people saying, I'm a photographer, not an artist, and it just seemed weird, and it didn't bother me particularly, but I think if you cloak other ideas behind that, like say, photography is constituted by the Western pictorial tradition, which I think is what Jeff Wall's whole, anytime he writes, this is the assumption that lurks behind it. Why not talk about the conventions that make up the understanding of the medium instead of treating the medium just because it refers to a concrete object, like, you can tell the difference between a glass of water and a photograph on a table because you go, it's a glass of water, it's a photograph, but to turn it into this, this inherent, there's a photographicness, this idea that something links together Wedgwood's plates and iPhone photo and, whatever, all of these different things just seems arbitrary to me. And it's only how useful it can be.
Sorry, just busy.
I just went off.
Synthesize, because I think this really is the meat of the discussion. I like proposing it as trans. That's not actually too bad. But I think, and speaking from the perspective of someone who works in an encyclopedic museum, what what seems very useful to me about keeping a photography department as such is that it allows you in an area that is otherwise heavily concentrated on contemporary art or recent modern art to go back almost 200 years. And that does stand out. Also, very importantly, that you can go back and forth between, to put it schematically, high and low cultures, and that is not so easy to do in other departments. I guess to put it in a larger way, you can model the variety, diversity, and even sort of constitutive incompatibility within other areas. You can actually model that as the identity of a department, which is why I like the trans idea. In other words, you could say, that's the program here. You can say it in any department, but you don't have to, whereas you really have to come to terms with this in photography, and that actually paradoxically justifies its existence, even though, right? So in other words, it's internal, the impossibility of unifying it then becomes the reason not to do away with it altogether, because you could actually then flaunt that and say, but in order to do it though, you would have to try to attend to these various mutually incompatible areas with some specificity. Okay, so a show on a 19th century subject would have to be different in some very demonstrative way than a show on a very recent subject. Or I mean, nothing is ever, but nothing is always, but let's say in a general way, a show on a vernacular subject should be thought through, presented in terms of how it's presented, written about, whatever, in quite a different way, right? So that you would have all these different standards for measuring the interest of a subject. And again, this would be part of, so you would say this is the model of the department. And in that way, it would be the microcosm, certainly in an encyclopedic museum, of what an encyclopedic museum is today. That is not, hopefully not some unified entity where you go from A to Z using the same criteria, but rather some kind of impossible plurality. Right, but you could actually have that as a program within one department, which is a lot easier to do than to try to make it a whole museum's program.
Well,
that speaks to answering your question.
I know in the nonfiction documentary world, they're going through an identity crisis because less and less people are watching 60-minute, 90-minute narrative documentaries, and the media, they call it transmedia, this way of trying to figure out how to make things work on iPhones, on the internet, and as well as shorter form documentaries, and kind of trying to figure out how what would traditionally be called a documentary can function on like 3 or 4 different platforms. But in relation to this question, I wanted to kind of pose my first question, which was, what will the photograph collection look like in 2030? Do you think you will need to be collecting actual objects, or will that at some point become obsolete? When are we going to stop being attached to what some people call the fetish object, which most people who were taking pictures in the color pictures in the 70s know fades. So there's this absurdity of like collecting a fetish that's going to like die before you get a chance to. And then, I think to me, that's the real question. I'm like, just as I'm getting into this thing, I'm really like afraid. I'm like, what if they just decide they're just going to like, show stuff on the internet, or how do you quantify or validate the photographic object at this point?
Well, just briefly, I think that in the next few decades, there won't be any reason to collect objects of contemporary photography because we will get to a stage where the colors can be calibrated so exactly that there will be no reason to have a print hanging in your storeroom. You can print on demand or however it'll be presented on a screen, or however the artist conceives it as being an object for exhibition. Most of the museums who collect photography collect historically as well, and historical photographs will continue to be collected, I think, and
how do I make
as
a historical
objects.
photograph, just in case?
Time machine.
Yeah.
But I want to follow up on what Matt said. I think photography has always been a hybrid thing from the very beginning. Daguerreotypes circulated as etchings, and most people who are talking about photography in the 1840s had never seen a photograph. So photography has never been one thing. And, it is also, I mean, what's so interesting to me about it is that it's both art and non-art and has always been that way. And it's the only way in a museum that, you could show, high and low together. I mean, we don't show paintings on canvas and house painting in the same context. And it would be great if we could, but the museums are not set up that way. However, they are set up that way for photography. And it's an amazing opportunity to be able to draw those connections and see the way that both artists and non-artists were doing similar things at similar times, both technically and in terms of the picture making. And that, that's one reason for keeping photography as this sort of hybrid category that, is always going to be kind of loose and, rough around the edges, because you don't really know where photography ends and something else begins. But it does seem, I can see how it seems useful from a curatorial point of view. I can see how it would be restrictive from an artist's point of view, and not wanting to think that you need to just work in this one medium when there are so many options for manifesting your ideas.
But I think it's the public side of it that gives me pause, but it's also not my problem. Like, I don't see it as something that I'm subjected to at all. But I do see it as a question that happens with the public: is how is this articulated to them? What's being glossed over when you do say this is discrete and ends here and begins here? How is that? How do you create an understanding that these come out of cataloging systems? There's nothing inherent or natural, or this doesn't just spring from the earth. This is not this.
Well, it's also a storage. I mean,
yeah,
wait,
it has to do with all
am
these
I the
other
only one
things.
that feels totally freaked out by what I just heard?
Yeah.
I'm like so freaked out.
Yeah, I want to come.
There must be a lot of things kind of, there's some also this high low that somehow in photography you can have really cheap shit and it can be hanging against something that's considered fine art, but then who decides what's the fine thing? And it, I mean, there are house painting and Pollock are really far apart, but there is bad Picabia, right, versus good Manet that could be in the same room in the same way that a certain kind of high or low photography. But who determines what's high and low? And there's so many, I mean, some people think street photography is boring, and some people think conceptual photography is boring, and some people think fashion photography is offensive, and some people think it's art. And I think it gets really confusing, the sort of, maybe there's, maybe in photography there's this problem of contortionists, that it's like almost too flexible, where people feel a kind of entitlement to say what they think is the high part of it and the low part of it. So I understand what you're saying because of its flexibility and because there's so many different kinds of pictures, and especially with vintage things, what was once a magazine picture in the 40s suddenly becomes high photography art.
I think what's happening, the people that you're referring to, like about Picabia, or I don't remember who was referring, this is still a fine art, right? Because it's an artist that it's already in the books, and there is house painting. Baldessari, I mean, he was commissioning house painters to do a painting for him, but and that's much more true of American institutions than European ones, but we do collect in like the film department or the photography department vernacular photographs or amateur photographs, family albums,
Just to clarify, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just, the distinction between what we call vernacular or high or low, it's about the intention of the person who made it. So it's not, a Cartier-Bresson picture made for a magazine. You're right. In some ways that transcends but we put it on the wall in the same way that we would put any other news photograph on the wall and call that a vernacular photograph. It's not meant to be disparaging, but it's part of the plurality of photographic image making, I think. And I think it's not us calling it high or low, it's about the intention of the person who created it.
But I'm going to go back to Mia's print-on-demand idea, which I really like. But on the other hand, when I read, I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen to Cunningham's work. But when the company is doing this last tour, and this will be it in terms of Cunningham's company performing the work, then a photograph being printed on demand becomes more like a dance performance. And there could be some photographers who refuse to, let their work after their lifetime go out as print on demand in the same way that a dancer might say that. Or there might be some.
It's kind of like
performance.
Yeah, I mean, when we collect color photographs, we buy reserve print that we keep in the dark and the cold so that it doesn't fade. And when the one that we show starts fading after 50 years, then we would destroy that exhibition print and replace it with the reserve print. So rather than having reserve prints, when photography becomes a fully digital medium, there's no reason to make the reserve print and put it in the refrigerator. You can just have the digital file calibrated, and then when you need the new print, just print it out. That's kind of what I mean by print on demand, like that it's all really been decided in advance by the artist. So, unless the artist wants to say, go ahead and improvise and, change the colors however you want, but most artists would say, no, I want this color to be exactly this blue. And when
But you could imagine a kind of situation like John Cage, where each performance becomes a different event. Perhaps.
Institutional
But
improvisation sounds great to me.
What I'm really curious about, though, is
Changing the color.
what I'm curious about is what happens when the lights go out, or there's no power. Then does the art just stop? And what about places where the power grid isn't up to supporting that kind of production, or places where there is no power grid? Do they not get art, contemporary art, then?
Okay.
You mean if the lights are out, is the art still there?
Well, I was using that as a metaphor. But yeah, I mean, you could say that, but as a metaphor, what happens if the lights go out? There's no power. Your means of observing the work is entirely dependent on being able to turn the lights on.
Keep in mind, in Hollywood now, they're copying all the films onto 35 millimeter film again and storing them, because the digital stuff is not. Those digital files won't last.
Yes, they will.
Won't.
That's like a totally paranoid sort of projection of what's going to happen to digital technology. Things will be upgraded. I mean, systems need to be upgraded, and the files will be upgraded along with them.
I guess, but less than the technical question, I'm more talking about conceptually. Like when we go to like Google has that, what's it called, where you can go into the museums and like see certain galleries and things like that. Like, why have an object that then people are going to log on?
But this is the same argument that Oliver Wendell Holmes made in like 1865 when he was talking about the stereograph. He's like, no one is ever going to travel again, and we're not going to need things. Tear it all up, knock down the architecture. We have stereographs of it, and that's going to be the end of physical objects.
Well, I mean, I think,
and it's always this cataclysmic removal of the thing itself that gets reenacted over. You know what I mean? It's like every day.
I mean, on a certain level, yeah. But I mean, I do think there's a lot of stuff like when digital. I know this is a sinking ship here, but when digital first got introduced, there was this whole argument about like it'll never, take over analog and blah blah blah, and increasingly less and less. Like, I know for a fact that everyone in this room has printed less photographs than they did 15 years ago. Like, you used to have photo albums. So you still have photo albums. Good. But like, there used to be these things where like, I used to like go to my grandmother's house and there'd be albums and albums and albums. Now it's just like, I don't want a photo album. I want to just like look at the pictures on my phone. If I don't have them on my phone, I don't really care anymore. And I think there's a way in which I do care less about this distinct photograph because I have so much access to other ones. And it's not, and I don't think it's a doomsday. It's just like, who cares is what I'm saying. Like,
but I think art is. But art is also different than popular use, right? Like.
You had a question?
So when a work comes into the collection, there would be a whole process by which the artist would have the opportunity to talk about what the parameters are for the future and possibly remaking the work. It's interesting you said light. I mean, we've had to deal with this issue in terms of, but Dan Flavin, if the neon light bulbs aren't being produced anymore, how do we present the work years into the future? And it's just kind of extending those arguments, a lot of them coming out of post-minimalist work, and looking at it in relation to photography. Another impetus for us had to do with collecting video. We got works on Laserdisc. You know, Laserdisc as a technology is gone. So I think we have to think about what the platform of display is and acknowledge that the technology is going to change. And so what can a master file be? And in terms of digital files, we have, you know, multiple backups of a certain kind of version. I mean, it's all a technology that's not something that I have to have confidence in the conservators, but there are people who are working on these issues. And it's not going to be a matter, I think, of going out and printing Cartier-Bresson necessarily. I think it can only be from this point forward with the artist-specific instructions. And there will be, I think, some artists who would prefer for their work to live a life that maybe ends, and others who would think about it, are going to think about what it could be in 500 years and actually think about it conceptually, because we don't know what kind of platforms there will be at that point in time.
Why not replace all fragile art objects then? I mean, why not just, you know, Newmans are hard to ship, right? Like they're easily injured.
I don't think
it wouldn't take that much to make one that would convince a public that they saw one. You know, it would look pretty much like the Zip. You know, why not? I mean, I don't see
It's
why
like Fahrenheit
photography
441.
in particular calls this question up, because that sounds totally weird.
But also, I just want to, I'm thinking about when I first started to really make bigger prints, and simultaneously was still not really taking care of my negatives. And so there would be occasions in which there would be giant splotches on faces, and I sort of taught myself how to spot, and I got really into it. And there was this moment when I kind of allowed the spots to show. Not that I would leave a white spot, but that I would spot something and it would have my hand. It would have an imperfection, and it wouldn't be the same spot twice. And, you know, there is something to being constantly caught in a medium where there is this idea of perfection because it's mechanical reproduction, and then there's the flaw, and there's how much flaw is acceptable. And I kind of got really okay with the idea that print, you know, number one didn't look exactly like print number two, and that there was a sense that there was some kind of human, you know, moment or, you know, a mark on something, and that it wasn't perfect. So the idea of something being reproducible, and my gallery is always saying, you know, go to Lamont and like we can just call up and we can order the print and you don't have to see it. And I do that sometimes, and that works great, and it's really you know, easy. And then I have the other prints that aren't at Lamont, and I have to kind of be more in touch with them. And I find that in that moment, there's the chance for me to say, well, you know, maybe magenta wasn't the way to go. And, you know, I have years worth of work printed by somebody that liked red. And so, you know, that work is redder, and it might not be right, and people see things differently. So, you know, papers change, all these things are flexible. And I think that, to me, the worst part of photography is the idea that there's a perfect thing and then you have to reproduce it 5 times.
A work of art is more than what it is of. People go to museums to see specific objects. If the paintings on the walls here at the Modern were forgeries, obvious forgeries by another by a master forger, and the paintings, the quote, real paintings were put in storage, I'm sure fewer people would come to the museum. All works of art have a presence to them, and they're printed, and photographs are printed on certain kinds of papers. If it's a digital print on a certain kind of paper, and that paper is reproduced, produced in 50 years, and you want to store the file electronically, then it would not be a problem. But if it's any other kind of substrate that's no longer available, then you're not really, you're showing a forgery.
But
you're no longer would be exhibiting a work of art.
But do you like to watch movies on television?
No, I don't own a television.
Okay, that's consistency.
No, I think. Okay, John, go ahead.
I think anybody listening to this conversation would come away from it thinking that photography is in a kind of crisis, and I think that that is actually a great indicator of its vitality. And I don't think the crisis stops at the level of art or curation. I mean, it's every day. There's not a week that goes by where you don't see some outrage over falsified, documentary photography, picture that's been printed, adding smoke over Lebanon to increase a sense of disaster or whatever. But I do think that part of the vitality is, and something that cuts across the different traditions that are being discussed here, is something that has to do with social engagement. And I think I would read the pictures generation as a form of social engagement, questioning authenticity, questioning commodity. But I also see this idea about the nature of freedom in a democratic society, transparency, what it means to be able to photograph on the street or be forbidden, barred to photograph somewhere else. And I also think that, just to throw it out, that actually for all of the hot debate about digital and shattered idioms, that there is something going on, as opposed to where we're at. There is something going on that has unfolded since 9/11, in which a lot of artists, young and old, have asked really important questions in their work about these issues, about the social landscape and how it can be represented. And I think that story could be told at some point. But I do think it's something that it's an interesting proposition as a unifying principle. And something that I think is important to photography's character, whatever you might call that. I can't say that I feel that urgency in other mediums. But it's like Heidegger said about poetry, it's the most refined art because it's made of the most degraded substance. And the more it gets dragged through the mud, the more it becomes digitized and disseminated, the more these moments of insight, I think, can happen, as opposed to not.
Regarding an apparent, maybe or maybe not, crisis in photography actually leading to productive ends. And I'm thinking of a great spectrum of practices, from maybe this year's Photo Fest, which concentrated on documentary photography, which seems to be invested in traditional notions of what a photograph is, to other things like, well, especially what you do with photograms or your FedEx boxes. So I wonder if there's a way to transpose your question and ask, what, if anything, is to be gained by asking the question, what is to be gained by approaching photography as a discrete medium? Maybe just that very question is provoking a range of interesting practices that are enlivening the practice of photography. Just in that practice is often trying to negotiate the definition of what a photograph is. So I wonder, among the photographers, do you find a problem of medium specificity somehow informing your practice? Or is that really something outside the parameters of things that enter your mind when you decide, like Penelope Umbrico, to take photos from the web and make enormous compositions with those?
I think it's an institutional and disciplinary question. For me, it's only one that an institution or an academy has to actually deal with when they're defining curriculum or department edges, and it's something that thankfully I'm free from. So in some sense, I don't, and I was a little obnoxious about the Barnett Newman thing and Jennifer and me, and I'm sorry, but I guess what I'm saying is it's funny to me why that question comes up in photography when you say, oh, these things are degrading or falling apart. Why don't we just set up a system to make copies? and why that question isn't like, oh, well, in the sculpture department, we have this very difficult object. Let's just make another one.
I'll just say, you know, we do it in photography, media, you know, all departments of the museum address when an object changes, whether it still represents what the artist intended it to represent, whether it's still exhibitable or not. So I remember when, and I bet Roxana remembers this, when Kirk Varnado was installing Kiki Smith's those metallized urns with the etched words on it, and they, you know, they'd been pristinely packed in crates, and they took them out, and they had turned all kinds, the mercury glass, sorry, that's what, they had turned all kinds of colors, and they had completely changed, and everyone was horrified, and conservation came in. And so they brought Kiki Smith in and showed them to her and said, oh my gosh, look what's happened. And she said, I love it. Don't change a thing, you know, leave it like it is. And so when artists are living and we have the opportunity to talk with them about what they want, what is the work to them, and whether that's photography or sculpture or media, understanding what it is and the way in which the platforms change. It's not just about degradation. And we have, I mean, our media department has a 30-page questionnaire that they send out to every new artist entering the collection. For us, it's a little simpler. It's only 2 pages. But what we're really trying to get at is what do you as the artist think of as your object, and what's our response? I mean, and that's, I think, where the departmental divisions, it's really the primary way in which they're helpful, is that some people know how to take care of some things and some people know how to take care of others. But as Roxana was saying, as an institution, we're much more interested in being responsive to whatever you're producing in whatever medium, and then we'll worry about who takes care of what, you know, that's sort of the backside.
I just meant on the level of an institution-wide policy where you would say, we want to keep one copy of this and then be able to replace it. I wonder if that is a question that's asked in like painting and sculpture, like, oh, if your painting falls apart, can we make another one later per your instructions? If that's a standardized policy, it just seems interesting that that would be discussed as a kind of solution or a way of dealing with collecting contemporary photography as a general policy. And I haven't
like
heard it
that
articulated in the
happens
same way
Solowit
with
all
other
the time, though, doesn't it?
particular artists who have particular constructions of their work where that's done. But I haven't heard it as a general policy or proposed as an idea for a general way of dealing with it.
But it's a medium where suddenly like anyone could do it. So what's the surprise? It used to be the medium anyone could do it, and now it's the medium anyone could reproduce what you did.
If you're not paying attention, if you're not looking at the details, because you can't really reproduce, you know, Carlton Watkins' photograph. You can't make it again. You can make something, you can define it in such a way that you're like, the difference between that thing and this thing doesn't matter.
No, I'm saying
yeah.
that it's the sort of, it's like the cross that was born for a while, that anyone could make a photograph, and of course that, what happens to that medium? It becomes the medium in which, well, we can reproduce your thing.
Right.
It's related.
It's a conceptual question. It's also kind of an interesting question that's coming out in light of the pictures generation and all our experience with appropriation and questioning about, you know, what is the original, what is our investment in it. I think, you know, as a historian, I have always been invested in the notion of the vintage or the actual, you know, print that was defined by the artist. But when you start to see things disappear, you start thinking about the future. I don't want, the color photography is a perfect example. It's going to disappear before our eyes. Can't people in the future experience it in some way? And I think it isn't the same as painting. You know, a painting has a lot longer life. It's a different kind of technology, and I see no reason why we can't ask new questions about a new medium, and why we have to use the old, you know, the model of painting as the only way to approach this. I don't see it as a challenge to the author or authorship at all. If the object is a handmade one that cannot be reproduced in the future, fine. But I see situations like, for example, slideshows that we have, whether it's, the projection of 35 millimeter slides. I don't want it to be put on a DVD, and then projected silently. I hope that there will always, somebody will hold on to a projector and project it, and we can always figure out a way to make the slide so that can happen. But you've got to be able to make some copies of the slides, for example.
I don't think we're really like in such an adversarial, the artists on one side and the curators, conservators on the other side. I think sometimes it feels odd to have one's work talked about as though someone can push a button somewhere. But in the end, I mean, I'm more concerned that somebody explains what my picture was about correctly than gives a print of it that's exactly like the print I made. To be honest, I'm not that invested in it.
Can I jump in here? This last point, I think there are two very separate conversations going on here. One has to do with, is photography in crisis, and the various photographies and uses of this image, what to do with this confluence or this variety of imaging. There's also the question of preserving them. This may be utterly simplistic, but I think the real crisis stems from authorship. I think that in the early 1980s, authorship came under assault, and rightfully so. And the last paradigms of the pure uses of photography stayed on as paradigms, and that's why you find students following straight photography. It's simple, there are guideposts. For people like you or you haven't been lionized sufficiently and authored sufficiently. I mean, you do something that's a kind of conceptual formalism that needs stating. And if students had you as an exemplar, they could the practice would revolve not around these simplistic questions. Is it straight photography? Is it stage photography? It's meaningless. Is it purely photographic? Is it painting related? That's meaningless. But to know that there's someone out there who's staked out a ground that I don't think anyone else has staked out, or you've done the same thing. And this is the reason why the work enduring in its pure form doesn't matter to you. What really does and should matter to you is that someone states the principles of the work, and the principles endure. And I think that the kind of falling away from authorship that occurred in the 1980s fell away on the part of artists who, because they didn't want to be guilty of self-valorization, and particularly white male artists didn't want that. And so there's been this, the medium is confused. It's dying of subtlety, and what it needs is strong positions. And you've taken one. You are all over the place taking it, but you're taking it kind of California, Yale, experimentalism.
Carpetbagger.
I know, but that's what you had to pierce. Let's not go into it now. But the real point of it is, I want to thread this to the institution and say that I think, there was such a strong curatorial voice here, and such a domineering one, that people of necessity have shied away from dominating the medium and shaping it in the way that John shaped it. But I think that it does need shaping. I think that if you may be right, John, that the medium is not in a true crisis. It's a crisis that's going to eventually be productive. But I think that if there were voices that were pointing out more clearly exemplars along the way, then maybe a lot of these other arguments would fall away. That may be utterly simplistic, but I really feel like young artists should be encouraged to have individual voices, which is the equivalent of authorship, but strong ones. And the institution needs to discern these voices and lionize them. And I think that the medium will not seem so confused.
Is it wrong that it is confused?
Yes, in my view, because I think that right now there are people who are staking out clear positions and they haven't been sufficiently identified. And I think that this creates a kind of sense of principlelessness that isn't really extant in the medium itself.
Right, but on the other hand, from what I was hearing from some other artists here, is that there is an issue with this ontological, question of the purity of the medium or the clarity of the medium, let's say, and that the fact that, in fact, photography may be a very impure art and may be contaminating or be contaminated by in various ways doesn't necessarily mean confusing in a way that is detrimental necessarily.
No, I can agree with that. And it's always going to be messy. It's not ever going to be ordered in the ways that it was, and rightfully so. But I do think that when people come along and do something that advances the medium, it isn't being identified and codified in quite the same ways that it was.
I think it takes a while, even when it was codified.
Hurry up.
I can give you. No, it's not about me. It's about everyone else here in the room. I think that we have a very clear example of now canonical exhibitions that were completely, missed or dismissed and which now are lionized, and they are case studies in curatorial and innovation. So that's what history does. Has its a life of,
Posterity makes the masterpiece, yes, but in the meanwhile there are less than masterpieces that need identification.
I would like to change directions a little bit. Joel, I wanted to ask you a question, and I can ask you the question because you're here. What was that question maybe it was talked about at the last forum, it wasn't, the color photography question. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you were asking? What was the question?
It relates to what Collier said. I do see a lot of, what a surprising development that here's this medium that's some 35, 40 years old, a brand new medium. And it seems as if the formal exploration of the medium has ceased. And the formal models that are out there are just being repeated with somewhat different content each time. And how can that be? How can it be that all of the way, admittedly, color and photography itself is a highly dysplastic medium, but nevertheless, how can it be that everything that's needs to be explored formally has been explored? Or, how can it be that of all the color theories that the Bauhaus came up with, color photography has identified one or two, and the others don't get investigated?
It's insanity. No, it isn't. If I see one more telephone pole, if I see one more parked car, if I see one more long highway, I'm going to jump out the window. I used to say, I don't want to see a naked girl in a stream. Just take it someplace else. And now I'm almost like, I'd rather see that than like a Stephen Shore or Joel Sternfeld. It's like, I love that work. But there is something weird about the fact that people still want to make it, and they're never going to make it as good as you guys did because they're not seeing it for the first time. It's just, and they don't have an attachment to the thing they're seeing. They have an attachment to the memory of the photograph that you took. It's like they're looking for nostalgia, and they can keep on making the thing and saying, but how come it doesn't look like that? Well, it doesn't look like it was taken 40 years ago.
But it sounds like it sounds like a problem that comes up because of the exact thing that you were calling for, an agreement about exemplars, a consensus about what's significant and important in charting those things. And when you look at, you know, in terms of even the points of references that I end up sharing with a lot of people my age that went through photography undergrads, like, yeah, Robert Frank, we looked at that a lot, and we looked at this a lot. We looked at the same, like, 15 people, and it's like weird, coast to coast, like this was photo. And this came from the huge power that you know, a set of voices had in defining what that history was and in identifying these exemplars. So the clarity that you're kind of calling for is the exact thing that to me, seems to be the problem, produces the problem that you're describing.
But with a different 15 names.
Well, there should be, yeah, like...
Joel, excuse me. Isn't the problem also that you teach and Stephen teaches? I mean, a lot of people.
That's a problem to me.
No,
He's
but I mean,
asking
if
you
you're
to stop.
saying this, you went to you have an MFA. Well, I mean, so the people you were talking to all discovered photography because they went to school. There are people in Joel's generation, of course, my generation, we're almost the exact same generation. We didn't discover photography in school. Photography was everywhere. You bumped into it. So if you're saying that it's the same Stephen Shore, the same Joel Sternfeld, I mean, frankly, they're two of the greatest photography teachers ever. I mean, I've taught with both of them, and it's amazing. But that could be a big part of the issue, right?
There's an argument to be made, you and I should make it, that it's the autodidact, that the history of the medium has been marked by autodidacts and not by people who were taught as such.
Can I ask you, who were you looking at when you started doing color photography?
I was looking at painting. Okay. I purposely didn't want to know.
I'm very interested in going back a minute to the departments and to the curatorial and even the autodidact. And the question is so interesting to me that the Cindy Sherman show is being prepared by the photography department. And maybe it's the last thing I think of Cindy is as a photographer. Eve, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, Cindy does make photographs, and they do live in our department because we have the best facilities to take care of her color photographs. We have a great color storage facility, but I think that's really besides the point. I think your question is a larger question, and I think speaks a little bit to what Roxana was saying, in that, in this institution, very much on the inside, we discuss these issues a lot. And we try and find ways that we can collaborate across departments. And certainly Cindy is an artist that many people in the museum know a lot about and are invested in her career. And when the show came to be proposed and was discussed, it was a discussion among many curators, not just in the photography department. And I think in the end, it doesn't really matter that it's me or the photography department organizing it. It matters that it's the museum organizing it. And I think it's the way that we are working towards within the museum, that we're continually sort of fighting these silos that have been erected for good reason in many cases. But I think Cindy's a perfect example, and all the artists of that generation, of ways in which curators really have to think, not just in terms of mediums, but really in terms of the ideas that they put forth. And on that note, I just wanted to say, since we talk a lot about this in this session, the pictures generation, for me, that's actually a really problematic term because it means so many different things. We say pictures generation, we say appropriation. Sarah, Sherry, Cindy, the three of you, you're doing all completely different things that are related, that are definitely challenging the ideas of authorship and certainly
But
also
that's why
what you
I
were
think
doing.
the
But to
idea of
kind of
generation, I mean, so it's a
definitely.
And by the
You're a
way,
painter.
because we are mentioning that, but that both Jean-François Chevrier, obviously you all know that, and Michael Fried is referring to pictures, not as a generation, but pictures very much to the tradition of, in fact, 19th century tableau painting when he talks about Jeff Wall. So that's another use of that term.
Yeah, but like any term, it's easy to use it as a kind of umbrella term for what, in fact, was many different things going on that were related, but going on at one moment. I see them as in fact much more complex than just one thing, which of course you do, you know as well.
Do you think Jeff Wall is a pictures generation artist?
I would not refer to him as that, no. Do you?
I never thought about it till just now. But for instance, and anyway, I'm blanking on a name. So
Hank Willis Thomas.
A late entry.
But there are painters in the pictures generation, and I think the thing to think about is, for so many of us that sort of, felt really influenced by it, it was because there were so many different kinds of things being practiced in it. I mean, there were, some shared.
I would put Marlene Dumas in the pictures generation. Seeing her show here, I realized that she's dealing with a lot of the same issues. So it's not only photographic. Yeah.
And then there's like bride of the pictures generation, and son of the pictures generation. I just have to say I had such because now I'm starting to feel like this is like the Dick Cavett show. I just have to share something that happened to me today. As I was walking down Roebling Avenue, I went into a store that's always barricaded, but it's full of really good-looking stuff. And the guy has not been open for 3 years, and he suddenly was open, and it had all these Vietnam lighters, which I got really obsessed with a couple of years ago, and I made Xeroxes from a book, and I made drawings, charcoal drawings of these lighters. And so we were talking about the lighters, and he said, "Oh, I made a book of these lighters." And I was like, "Oh my God, I appropriated the pictures in your book and I made drawings." And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a photographer." So sort of, a long way of kind of going to the son of the pictures generation. But on that note, James.
I mean, I do think for me there's that struggle where it's like I've often introduced and speak of myself as a photographer, and then people say, "Well, what kind of pictures?" And I'll say, "Well, I actually use other people's pictures," and that becomes this weird conversation where, like, often with my work, and I'm happy that MoMA just acquired some of my work, but it's also this weird thing of being like the first pictures that they acquired of mine are pictures that I acquired, from appropriation, and so it's like this congratulations, but it's also kind of a weird kind of feeling of like, am I not good enough in my own pictures? And that, no, I mean, it's not like there's that question of like, although I know how to take a good picture, but I'm not sure if it's good art, and I know how to make good art, but I'm not sure if they're always going to be my pictures.
And also, of course, they never buy, they're not always going to, no one always likes the part of you that you want like the most. And, then you get old and they just either don't like you at all or they like everything. Or they pretend to like stuff and you pretend to be happy of the stuff they like.
I'm ready for that.
No, but and you get lucky maybe, and there's that like kind of kismet curator that kind of gets you in all your entirety. But I think, I think it's a really generous thing to let people like the parts of you that they like, and think that somebody will always be there to like some, ignored part at some point.
So I think we've come to the point in the evening where we can continue the discussion over drinks. I want to thank the four artists today, Hank, Walid, Collier, and Jim, for their generosity and for their probing questions. And I want to thank all of you for coming and participating.